It is by now little secret to anyone, at least anyone willing to look beyond the obsequious MSM headlines and nauseating Netflix puff pieces, that far from the organic uprising it has been presented as, Ukraine's 2014 Maidan revolution was in fact a DC-designed, oligarch-funded coup d'etat intended to establish another vassal of the Anglo-American Empire. Leaked phone calls between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt reveal how such folks first provoked the carnage which engulfed the country, only to cynically oversee its reconstruction, refining as they did a strategy already implemented in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, alongside a litany of other flashpoints throughout the post-Soviet world. More troubling still is that, in a bid to open up new fronts in its ongoing proxy war with Russia, the US is planning a fresh wave of this covert regime change. Operating through a network of NGOs and other ostensibly humanitarian organisations, shadowy deep state actors are now fomenting so-called colour revolutions in Georgia, Hungary, Moldova and beyond, each carefully contrived crisis following a formula first codified by neoliberal stalwart Michael McFaul. McFaul's relationship to Russia began back when Moscow was at the epicenter of the USSR and he was still an undergraduate at Stanford, the future US ambassador spending several semesters in the country learning the local language. Quite what prompted this early interest remains unclear. What is known, however, is that it was an interest which would ultimately evolve into, after years spent as a political science professor and contributor to numerous influential think tanks, a role within the Obama administration, specifically as chief architect of the ominously titled Russian reset policy. After the 2016 election, McFaul would take a hiatus from Washington to become a professional critic, both on mainstream and social media, of the Trump White House, often using his platform to cheerlead the now resoundingly debunked Russiagate controversy. Amid a lengthy list of publications, McFaul would pen his comparatively overlooked Transitions for Post-Communism. In it, the author breaks down what might be regarded as his primary area of expertise, namely colour revolutions, or as he calls them, democratic breakthroughs, and the 7 pillars which need be erected in order for these to ignite. The most foundational element in overthrowing any inconvenient government, at least according to McFaul, is that said government be headed by a leader who either is, or might be depicted as, semi-autocratic. The reasons for this are twofold. In addition to the fact that mere semi-autocracy would not grant the powers necessary to simply crush any nascent uprising, whatever strongman tendencies the targeted politician does exhibit may be inflated through the magic of bought and paid for media into something approximating Hitlerian. With the exception of Vladimir Putin, it is perhaps Viktor Orban who is undergoing the most explicit example of this rebrand. Aided by a proliferation of self-styled journalistic watchdogs like Action for Democracy, institutions whose finances can invariably be traced back to US aid and the meddling hand of Samantha Power, Biden's State Department is seeking to portray both the Hungarian Prime Minister and Hungarian society as repressive, paranoid and vengeful. This is tenuous at best. After all, such rhetoric comes just 2 years since Orban's landslide re-election, his opposition to both war and wokeist absurdity mirroring that of the country at large. But of course, democracy was never Washington's concern. Instead, what these anti-Orban sentiments amount to is an attempt to undermine, however artificially, a leader who stands in opposition to US ambitions in the region, sentiments which have already succeeded in setting into motion what has become known as the Paprika Revolution. This achieved, it is now much easier to foster the narrative that the leader in question is not just a despot, but a bitterly despised despot. Again, shielding their motives behind the fig leaf of humanitarianism, CIA and State Department operatives set about equipping amenable opposition in the country with both the tools and the know-how to turn this engineered discontent into a tidal wave of peaceful protests, instructing activists how to organise on social media, providing them with placards, and demonstrating how to elicit outrage-inducing reactions from the police. These tactics were recently on display during last year's attempted overthrow of the Georgian government. This came in response to a bill requiring all foreign funding in the nation's politics to be labelled as such, an eminently sensible piece of legislation that would have been a near carbon copy of laws in place throughout much of the Western world. However, fearful that the control might be diminished, White House-affiliated NGOs used their sway to encourage tens of thousands of demonstrators to gather outside the parliament in Tbilisi, the crowd smashing windows and hurling petrol bombs with such murderous intent that the bill was shelved indefinitely. At this point, the focus for architects of a colour revolution will shift from inflaming tensions to embellishing malcontents with a jaunty moniker, photogenic figureheads, a scrappy young upstart backstory, but above all, an image. In effect, creating an identifiable us to be sported against an already determined them. This will, almost without fail, start with the formation, or occasionally the hijacking, of Western-minded youth movements. The first clear-cut instance of this was back in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, when students at Belgrade's two public universities, under significant direction from their American overseers, founded Otpor, Resistance, a group that would prove integral to the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic. Their success came to constitute a template for equivalent organisations across the Kremlin sphere of influence, including, but hardly limited to, Kamara, Enough in Georgia, Pora, It's Time in Ukraine, and Kel, Renaissance in Kyrgyzstan. This time, the strategic assistance these groups received was largely from the US Embassy assembled Freedom of Choice Coalition, their activities made possible by contributions from the World Bank, the CIA-associated National Endowment for Democracy, and of course, that ever-present feature of colour revolutions, George Soros. Suffice to say, there exists a chasm between the rhetoric espoused by McFaul and his underlying intent. After the 2020 US election, only the terminally gullible could maintain that the American political establishment has any regard whatsoever for independent electoral monitoring capabilities. McFaul's obscurantism and neoliberal doublespeak little more than cover for a far more insidious agenda. After all, what are these election monitors independent from? It is certainly not US interests. Neither is it from organisations like the Open Foundation, the European Union, or BlackRock. Rather, what Transparency Armenia, Association Promo Lex of Moldova, and other such Western-led NGOs represent is a parallel vote-tallying system capable of rubber-stamping or undermining elections at will. The legitimacy of these is entirely beside the point. Allegations of fraud from such well-resourced agencies have the potential to turn whatever social upheaval has already been precipitated into full-blown revolutionary fervour, the groundwork already being laid to discredit forthcoming elections in Kosovo, Czechia, Romania, and perhaps most consequential of all, Hungary. Once more, McFaul's efforts to obfuscate deep state objectives is palpable. The media he and his cohorts seek to install is no more independent than the marionettes they call election observers, the purpose of the former solely and exclusively to amplify claims made by the latter. Again, Ukraine provides a prime example, this time in the form of the 2005 Orange Revolution. Following Viktor Yanukovych's declaration of victory at the ballot box, the Kremlin-aligned leader was met with wave upon wave of protests insisting the vote was rigged. But while the mass mobilization of students in Kiev soon came to dominate global news coverage, it was far from reflective of sentiments within the nation as a whole. Nevertheless, this impression continued to be cultivated by a Soros-bankrolled profusion of NGOs, whose stated modus operandi of promoting journalistic integrity differed quite dramatically from their observable behaviour. Not only did they exaggerate the transgressions of Yanukovych's party, so too did they turn a blind eye to the equally clear violations committed by Washington's preferred candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, whitewashing from the narrative altogether some of the more unseemly elements lurking among the demonstrators. In the midst of this chaos, all that is required to complete the illusion of a popular primal cry for democracy is for these energised and artificially incentivised agitators to be joined on the streets by the rest of the public. This can be encouraged either through the thinly veiled rhetoric of complicit politicians or their more direct calls for action, few people fully appreciating, until it is much too late, the ruinous pull of mob mentality. And never or nowhere did this prove bloodier than in Kyrgyzstan's 2005 Tulip Revolution. Due to its proximity to Russia, shared border with China, and its implicit connection to Islamic leaders in Tehran, the small mountainous nation has likely received a higher per capita injection of destabilizing funding than any other, NGOs such as IREX winning over westward-looking opposition through lavishly funded conferences and exchange programs. Their loyalty assured, these accomplices were first instructed to instigate street demonstrations against President Askar Akayev, and then, whenever riots inevitably broke out, to keep fanning the flames until the last vestiges of his government had fled. This even extended to the release of violent prisoners under the condition they exacerbate the carnage, an orgy of death and destruction which left deep and enduring scars throughout Kyrgyz society, and which was to be repeated just 5 years later when American officials grew frustrated with those they had helped install. Unquestionably the most dangerous component of a colour revolution, at least from the perspective of the authority earmarked for elimination, is an insubordinate police and military. Even a single instance of dissent can quickly spread throughout the ranks, rendering the outgoing establishment toothless and thus clearing the way for US-backed forces to seize power. For the most illustrative example of this, one need not venture as far as the former Soviet bloc, or even study similar psychological operations conducted in the Middle East, but rather to look much closer to home. Both the BALM orchestrated demoralization of the police and the woke castration of the military, following McFaul's playbook to a T. This is hardly the only pillar of his to have been erected domestically. Indeed, the listener will no doubt recognise echoes of America's recent history in all 7 stages described, whether this be the rise of Antifa, the wholesale weaponization of the media, a fake insurrection, or most obvious of all, the hysterical hair-trigger accusation of fascist. Given the cast of corrupt incompetents now occupying the White House, it is difficult not to conclude that America has been subjected to a colour revolution of its own. This insidious new form of warfare is sure to be repeated, and repeated with ever-increasing precision, as the neoliberal world order continues its march towards uncontested global dominion.